Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today as we honor Jenny Pizer as this year's Outlaw Alumna of the Year. I want to welcome you all from all over the country, whether you be students, alumni, faculty, administrators, or admitted students. My name is Deb McCowan, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Outlaw this year. For many years, we have worked in partnership with the Office of Alumni Relations to host this event. It's always an amazing way to honor those who have come before us for all the work that they do to make this a more loving and caring world. Outlaw is one of the oldest affinity groups in this law school, having helped the LGBTQ community survive and thrive through the AIDS epidemic, Orange v. Texas, and the nationalization of marriage equality. However, as we all know, there are still struggles facing the LGBTQ community, from the murders of trans people to LGBTQ youth homelessness to the fight against conversion therapy. As such, we will continue to work in support of LGBTQ+ positive policies and legislation. Additionally, here at the law school this past fall, Outlaw has brought together community members through monthly general body meetings, open bars, visits to museums, and various other social events, while also introducing Outlaw members to firms and public interest organizations, preparing our members for their future careers. We were even able to successfully petition the university to increase the number of gender-neutral bathrooms on campus. Outlaw is an organization that wants to recognize both our past and our future. By taking the time to honor Outlaw alumni, we acknowledge the hardships that we have gone through in the past and the work that our alumni do to create a better future. Today, we're doing that by honoring Jenny Pizer as our Alumna of the Year. Now, I'll hand it off to Dean of the NYU School of Law, Trevor Morrison.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I am very pleased to welcome you to NYU Law, at least virtually, for this year's NYU Law Outlaw Alumni Reception, really one of the most important alumni gatherings at the law school every year. We, of course, wish that we could all be celebrating in person, but we're glad that we can gather virtually this way to celebrate the important work of Outlaw, our outstanding alumni, and our great student leaders in Outlaw as well. We are proud that NYU Law as an institution has long been a leader among law schools in fighting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and related categories. In 1978, our law school became the first law school in the United States to deny its career services to employers that discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation, having already denied those services to employers that discriminate on the basis of race, gender, religion, national origin, or disability. Years later, during the enforcement of the so-called Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, NYU Law was a real leader in challenging the constitutionality of the Solomon Amendment, under which the federal government threatened to cut federal funding to universities that refused to cooperate with military recruiters, despite the existence of the discriminatory Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And although NYU did not prevail in that litigation, it continues to be a point of institutional pride that the school stood up for the principles of equality that we all espouse and strive to achieve. Today, the school remains committed to having a diverse and engaged student body, to offering equal opportunities to all of our students without regard to background, and to creating a truly inclusive and welcoming environment, in particular for our students in the LGBTQ+ community. Outlaw itself helps us fulfill all of these missions and more. It is an outstanding student-led organization that does great work advocating for issues within the law school community, educating the law school community, and engaging with important legal and policy issues in this space beyond the law school as well. I want to thank and congratulate this year's Outlaw Alumna of the Year, Jennifer Pizer, class of 1988, the Senior Counsel and Director of Strategic Initiatives at Lambda Legal. Cheng-Hao Key, class of 23, will introduce Jenny Pizer in a moment, but I personally want to say how proud we are of her as a distinguished graduate of this law school and how grateful we are to her for her leadership and exceptional contributions to the law. Outlaw first established this tradition of honoring a distinguished graduate during their annual reception in 2013. And in the years since then, a great many distinguished graduates of this school have been honored, people working in all areas of the legal profession, from private practice to public interest advocacy organizations, to government service, and the judiciary as well. And we are really thrilled this year to add to the ranks of that distinguished group, Jennifer Pizer. Again, I am grateful to our talented and enthusiastic student leaders of Outlaw, as well as to the alumni of Outlaw who've joined us again this evening. Thank you all for your wonderful work. And with that, I will turn things over to Cheng-Hao Kee.
All right, thanks to Dean Morrison for those remarks. For decades, Jenny Pizer has been a leading voice in the fight to end discrimination against the LGBTQ+ community and fight for our rights. She has been lead and co-counsel for a variety of seminal cases across the United States. She was lead counsel for Majors v. Jeans, a 2014 case that ended Arizona's same-sex marriage ban, and was co-counsel in the litigation that won same-sex marriage rights for Californians in 2008 before the passage of Prop 8. She has worked to defend the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals against discrimination in employment, healthcare, and education. Representing Keith Brodkowski, a gay man whose partner was killed in the 9/11 attacks, Lydia Ramos, who fought to retrieve her daughter from homophobic relatives after the death of Lydia's partner, and Guadalupe Benitez, a lesbian denied infertility care due to her doctor's discriminatory religious objections. In addition to her litigation accomplishments, Jenny has also worked extensively in policy development to protect same-sex couples and their families. She has consulted extensively on marriage equality bills and marriage equality ballot language in a number of states, and was a lead drafter in non-discrimination campaigns in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. For 26 years, Jenny has worked extraordinarily hard as a senior counsel and director of law and policy at Lambda Legal, and has dedicated her life to making the world a better and safer place for the LGBTQ+ people across the nation. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming the recipient of the 2022 Outlaw Alumna of the Year Award, Jenny Pizer.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm truly delighted to receive this honor, and even more so to have this chance to interact with the leadership of this organization that I've had the privilege of leading during my second year in the law school back in 1985 to 1986. My co-chair at that time was a classmate and close friend, Charlie Spiegel, who's remained a close friend across all these years, with many of those years devoted to Lambda Legal work together. And my best advisor, confidant, and critic, then and still, was a classmate I met on our first day, Dorina Wong, who's been my partner for the past 37 years, and my wife since we won the California marriage litigation 13 years ago. Now, I share those names because I'm about to respond to the request to speak a bit about the future of our LGBTQ movement. After marriage equality, where the fight should go from here, ways to engage people who might have drifted away, perhaps thinking the fight ended with our nationwide success in 2015. But as we identify priority themes and think about strategies for moving forward in these very challenging times, let's never lose sight of the fact that this work is about real people, some of whom are our closest loved ones, some of whom we'll never know, some of whom will be mentors, colleagues, collaborators, whose friendships will enrich every day and make the shared journey worthwhile. We face very significant challenges. With that in mind, I'd like to identify and briefly discuss 5 priority goals that require our keen attention and resources right now. So first, stopping the targeting and then making our society safe and inclusive for transgender and non-binary people, especially young people. 2, stopping and then reversing the dangerous overexpansion of religious rights to discriminate and to act in other ways at the expense of other people. 3, addressing the impacts of social stigma and discrimination, which include poverty, health disparities, homelessness, vulnerability to violence, all of which fall most heavily on those who are most marginalized and most vulnerable. 4, increasing judicial diversity on both the federal and state court benches, plus insisting upon regained balance at the US Supreme Court. And 5, looking beyond our national borders. We are an interconnected global family and global movement now, and progress or repression in some parts of the world affect other parts. And on this point, I proudly want to acknowledge my current role as board co-chair of Outright Action International, formerly known as the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, which is headquartered close to all of you in New York City, right by the UN. I hope most of you are familiar with Outright's amazing work. So to take each of these 5 themes in turn, let's start with the attacks on transgender, gender diverse, and non-binary people. Now, last year, we saw an obscene frenzy of hundreds of bills, I'm not exaggerating, in state legislatures targeting transgender people, especially trans and non-binary children and youth. In the name of protecting children, they aim to deny access to public facilities, to medical care, to updating identity documents, to school programs, including sports. They also aim to facilitate censorship of accurate information about LGBTQ people in school classrooms and the removal of books from schools and public libraries. Now, we've seen this kind of targeting repeatedly before. Anita Bryant, famously in the 1970s, led the campaign to repeal the non-discrimination ordinance that had been passed in Dade County, Florida, using the slogan, "Save Our Children." By falsely portraying gay men as sexual predators, she succeeded. The proponents of Prop 8 also succeeded with their campaign to end our freedom to marry in California, at least for a few years, with ads suggesting in similarly insidious ways that children are harmed when same-sex couples have equal marriage rights. And then in 2014, when it became clear that we were going to prevail nationwide on marriage, we saw the next version of this tactic emerge, the slogan, "No men in women's restrooms," falsely and cruelly portraying transgender women as a threat. Now the targeting shifts to parents, doctors, and educators who listen to and support young trans people who come out and ask for their help. So this targeting has to stop, and these young people must be protected. Second theme, the dangerous expansion of religious rights to discriminate, which is a central area of my current work. From Hobby Lobby to Masterpiece Cake Shop, to Trinity Lutheran, to Our Lady of Guadalupe, to Fulton versus Philadelphia, and more cases in between, the pattern of decisions from the US Supreme Court has become all too predictable, and it's alarming. Even before Senator McConnell had engineered confirmation of 3 darlings from the Heritage Foundation, the court had started down this path, and it's been consistent in the results. The religious claimant always wins. And the reasoning, well, there's some consistency there too, and it's problematic. The court majority professes to be doing nothing remarkable, often to be applying long settled doctrine in an unremarkable way, and yet the familiar principles are not applying in a recognizable way. When gay couples are refused service, contrary to a non-discrimination law, their claim somehow seems to evaporate. When they apply to a government-funded program to be screened to be foster parents, supposedly protected by multiple non-discrimination rules, they're told to go elsewhere because the agency doesn't serve their kind. Churches win the right to demand taxpayer dollars to upgrade their facilities, and religious schools win the right to deem all sorts of teachers ministers, and thereby strip them of key workplace protections. The court is considering whether religious schools can demand taxpayer funding for education steeped in religious content. Now, of course, those litigants were all very conservative Christian schools. And you might recall that this court also upheld Trump's Muslim ban. So this is not even-handed. The First Amendment's 2 religion clauses are supposed to be in balance, protecting freedom of religion and freedom from religion. But in our current Supreme Court, the Free Exercise Clause seems to have morphed into Pac-Man, and yes, that is a 1980s reference, and to have devoured the Establishment Clause, bite by bite by bite, leaving hardly any trace. Our movement has faced a hostile Supreme Court before. In fact, it was especially dramatic the year I was co-chair of this group, 1986, when it decided same-sex couples have no constitutional privacy rights and can be subjected to arrest and prosecution for adult intimacy in our own bedrooms. And yes, that was the Bowers versus Hardwick case. We shifted our strategies then. We moved into state courts and developed more robust equal protection approaches. And we'll probably make some analogous shifts now. But let's never think our advocacy can succeed if we just litigate. Our movement flourishes by telling our stories and calling for justice in every forum simultaneously. So there are three things I try to keep in mind in this area. One is that some faith leaders and heads of religious institutions do understand that expanded freedom to discriminate based on religion easily can be turned around against religious groups when they fall out of majoritarian favor. We all have a stake in rules that protect everyone equally. Also, some religious conservatives with whom I engage these days do seem to be grappling with a cognitive disconnect. They've believed that the way to serve others in a loving, generous way and to build a strong society is by following their religious tenets. And yet they do see that religious condemnation of LGBTQ people inflicts pain, and rejection causes young people, especially, to engage in self-harm and often to flee. And as has been going on for decades now, it's not just religious conservative individuals who struggle. Denominations are debating and struggling internally too. Change is happening before our eyes, though admittedly, not everywhere, and in my view, not nearly quickly enough. The third thing is that despite certain etiquette rules against critiquing others' religious beliefs, I do believe we need to engage in kind but serious ways in conversations about beliefs that call for or justify discrimination or any mistreatment of those who don't conform to one's own beliefs. After all, certain religious beliefs were invoked to justify all kinds of things, including slavery and then persistent white supremacy, and subordination of women, and so much abuse of LGBTQ people, and more. That's not all religions, obviously, but there mustn't be a magic mute button that silences discussion of the impacts of particular teachings, whether they're rooted in religion, cultural traditions, or any other belief system. So turning back to our five main themes, number 3 is about social stigma and discrimination. Now we know they hit hardest the most vulnerable members of our communities, especially those who are BIPOC, trans, non-binary, folks who face the greatest marginalization. Opinion research confirms that there continue to be many people who believe that LGBTQ people are mostly white, wealthy, and urban, and we spend our time, at least before COVID, shopping and brunching. And that discrimination against us isn't a problem. Instead, social science research and data compiled by Land O'Legal's Help Desk confirm that discrimination does remain pervasive and causes elevated rates of poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, and all sorts of experiences of harassment and for some people for violence. Many of us are raising children who likewise suffer the economic, social, and health impacts of this discrimination. Opinion research also confirms that majorities believe we have all the legal protections that we need. Now, winning marriage was huge, no question. But nationwide protection against discrimination in employment, housing, public spaces, and services is also essential and has been essential for a very long time. Remains so, especially given the persistence of discrimination in all of those areas. Our communities have been pushing for federal protections for 40 years. We've won important protections via sex discrimination theories, litigation all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Federal Equality Act bill that I've had the privilege of working on now for quite a few years would fill in big gaps. The House has passed it repeatedly. It's pending in the Senate Judiciary Committee now. It needs to be passed. Now, in addition to updated comprehensive legal protections, our communities need lawyers to help them enforce the rights they do have and the rights they will have. Many of you will spend time in commercial law practice when you graduate, and either at those firms or when you move on to other things, please consider ways to include some civil rights cases in your mix. You're needed. People need you. Those legal protections will not be able to do their job if people can't find lawyers to speak for them. And the last point for this particular theme relates to the earlier one, the role of anti-LGBTQ religious biases in social and medical services delivery. Now, Congress passed the Charitable Choice Act in 1996, which allowed federal funding of religious organizations to provide social services as long as they don't discriminate or include religious content in those services. From the administration of George W. Bush onward, there's been a steadily increased funneling of funding to religious institutions and steady advocacy by conservative religious institutions to unravel the non-discrimination strings. This has ended up with many of those served by federal programs being vulnerable to proselytizing, imposition of religious practices, and overt discrimination. This is not okay. Now, some people say the adverse impacts of discrimination are similar regardless of the discrimination's motive. I've come to believe religious motives in some ways can make the impacts worse, for at least these two reasons. First, as a practical matter, many large religious institutions have resources, power, and influence against which program beneficiaries really can't protest. And also, as I said before, many people acting out of religious motives think of themselves as being virtuous and don't realize, they don't accept that the harm they cause is wrongful. Also, religious institutions and individuals often get the benefit of the social convention we have, that it's rude and inappropriate to challenge anyone's religious beliefs, even when those beliefs cause harmful conduct. So this is challenging. But our movement has had to deal with this from the beginning and continuously. I recall religious conservatives blocked the passage of New York City's then called Gay Rights Ordinance from 1971 all the way to 1986, a year that I keep referencing. Tom Stoddard, who was a Hayes Fellow at NYU in the 1970s, was teaching here at NYU at the time, and he was Lamber-Legal's executive director at the same time. He was a mentor and a friend and one of the most effective advocates for that bill. And he addressed those religious objections. He was determined, he was fully engaged. In particular, he was warm and welcoming and persuasive, and eventually that bill provided protections for people in New York City. It was an important breakthrough. So let me shift to number 4 on my list of major themes, which is the crisis of imbalance in the federal courts. Now, you all know that during the 4 years of the Trump administration, the Senate confirmed judges with alarming speed, faster than any president had done previously in recent previous history. In addition to his highly controversial appointees to the Supreme Court, I want to give you a couple of additional wake-up call stats from the analysis that we published at the close of the Trump administration. This is through our Fair Courts project. One, that President Trump succeeded in filling 1/3 of the federal appellate bench with his nominees. Also, nearly 85% of those circuit court picks were white, 80% were men, and not one circuit nominee was Black. And third, 40% of Trump's confirmed federal appellate judges had prior demonstrated anti-LGBT bias in their records. There are similar issues to be considered in state court systems, in law enforcement, and in our federal immigration courts and detention systems. Just as there's disproportionate poverty among our communities, we're overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, the larger prison system, and in immigration detention. In my view, out of sight should never be out of mind if we care about our most vulnerable community members. And I'm not all gloom and doom about this. President Biden has nominated more than 80 candidates to the federal bench. The Senate has confirmed 44 so far, including record numbers of racial minorities, women of color, and some members of our LGBTQ community, including Beth Robinson, who is a leader of Vermont's marriage equality work and now sits on the Second Circuit, the first out lesbian on the federal appellate bench. But it is 2022, and she's the first. We have a lot of catching up to do, and there is still not even one openly trans federal judge on the federal bench, period. We are still dramatically overrepresented. So the last point I want to touch briefly is the need to look beyond our borders. Just today, Outright released a report together with Human Rights Watch about the plight of LGBTQ people in Afghanistan. Conditions were difficult there before, but under the Taliban, they're pervasively life-threatening. And meanwhile, especially in Eastern Europe and parts of Africa, American religious fundamentalist lawyers are joining with local autocrats and demagogues to deploy anti-LGBTQ rhetoric as political tools. Many of those Americans are building their networks overseas because they faced increased skepticism and pushback here at home. In addition to the sense of responsibility some of us might feel about the horrible impacts those Americans are having, there's pragmatic reasons for us to be concerned. Many of us travel for work, to stay connected with families in countries of origin, for fun and learning. We can stay focused here at home, kind of insular, and we can ignore the othering of LGBTQ people in other areas, sometimes made worse by our fellow Americans, or we can share our resources, we can amplify others' voices, and we can help build a world that's safer for all of us. That's the approach I commend to each of you for your own enrichment, for inspiration, and for a sustaining sense of gratitude for what we're able to accomplish in our privileged roles as advocates for a better world. So thanks for this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you, and thanks so much for this great award. I really treasure it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jenny, for the great words. So now we'll move to a Q&A portion. We will now welcome questions from the audience that anyone has for Jenny. Please submit them using the Q&A feature below. We'll do your best to answer them as the time permits. So the first thing that I'll ask is, like you mentioned many times, the year 1986 and your time here as like leading outlaw as well. So I'd love to just like ask you, like, how was it being queer here at NYU back when you were here, living through the height of the AIDS epidemic, living through Bowers v. Hardwick? Like, what do you remember from your time being here?
Well, I should start by saying, you know, what I remember best is that I found my sweetie, and I will always be grateful for that. She also is a public interest lawyer, and, you know, our lives have been very full and rich as a result. But beyond the personal, what I would say is, first of all, when we started as first-year students, very few members of our class were out at the time. We came to know there were quite a few people present, but most were not out. But for whatever wonderful reason, there happened to be quite a lot of out politically engaged lesbians in the third-year class. So that was fantastic. And there were some out adjunct faculty who were wonderful, including Tom Stoddard, who I mentioned. And there were a couple of tenured faculty, not many. This organization, I want to acknowledge, at the time was named Lesbian and Gay Law Students. There were no out trans, let alone non-binary students or faculty. And there were a lot of public community debates about outing at that time. And then some of that, I think, did fade because the HIV crisis hit, and it was particularly devastating in New York City. We lost so many members of, you know, movement leaders. There was fear, there was stigma, and as a movement, we had to build our own institutions. I imagine many of you know this history, but among the things that I appreciated at the time and still is that it did cause lots of gay men to welcome the help of lesbians during that time of crisis. And so lots of organizations moved from being largely led by white gay men to co-gender leadership and a lot more racial diversity, and a lot of radical organizing and direct action, which I commend to all of you. It's really fun and important. I hope many of you, I imagine you know the names ACT UP and so forth, but I hope you also know about the Lesbian Avengers and Queer Nation. And I guess the main thing is that the whole legal community was so small, like we all knew each other and the legal organizations were so small. When I did my internship at Lambda Legal, you know, the office was two small offices in the ACLU building. There was one lawyer, and when I went to work with her, I had to sit on the floor in the hall. So I say this as there's so much hard work we have to do now, but to appreciate what we've built as a community. And it really is because people participated with their energy, their time, their voices, and their financial resources. So I want to be really grateful about that.
Wonderful. So you've obviously are working at Lambda Legal and have worked in the space of LGBTQ equality. What kind of lessons have you learned about the LGBTQ community, allyship, and coalition building during your time working in the field?
Yeah, so I've had the privilege of playing a number of different sorts of roles, and different types of work have required different, different coalitions and different skills. So I guess what I would emphasize is, like, the work is often hard and contentious, and it is sometimes overwhelming. And that's true today, even though our organizations and movement have grown. The other side is often so much bigger, especially if we're suing the Trump administration or the state of Texas. But even when it's overwhelming, I have found that this is among the most rewarding work a person can do. And this is true across other movements and other issues. But in this movement, we're a tiny percentage of the population. So coalition building is essential. And that does require many types of allyship, and that it can be hard to be flexible and generous and to really listen, when you feel under siege or you're frustrated or angry and exhausted. It's all the more reason that we have to be kind and gentle with each other, and to be realistic about what we can expect of each other, and of ourselves, because we've made a lot of progress, and the legal work has, of course, been important, but the relentless organizing and public education and cross-movement collaboration, we wouldn't have succeeded without that. And I guess I do want to emphasize and appreciate that one of our most important strengths is that our community is so extraordinarily diverse. So, we're everywhere. We have messengers in every community. And, this was instrumental in our being able to win marriage, and it will be instrumental in our ability eventually to secure comprehensive non-discrimination protections.
Great. One conversation that we, at least public interest people, I think have a lot in law school is whether the law is like the most effective tool for change, right? So I guess the question to you is, what do you feel are the most effective routes through which to fight for equity and against discrimination? What role does the legal system have in this fight?
Well, and we had the same conversations when I was in law school, and I imagine we will always have them, and that's a really important, healthy thing. So, in my view, there's no one recipe, no one most effective approach. All of the different approaches can make a difference. It depends on the issue and the time and the place and what are your resources. So the legal work is never enough alone, but I do think it is necessary, absolutely. And this is true even when the courts are hostile. We have to be able to bring the fight, but we have to be able to do it strategically. And sometimes we know we're likely to lose. But so I want to quote my good friend Evan Wolfson, who says, "Well, but can we lose forward? If we bring a case that we know we're going to lose, will we amplify a story of injustice that reaches people, even if we think the judge's ears are going to be closed, or the justice's ears are going to be closed?" If we do too much of that, we just build a mountain of adverse precedent, and that's not helpful. But we need to participate in the process of having top quality, good people interested in being judges and representing the full diversity of the community. We need to participate in legislative work, which didn't get enough attention when I was in law school, and I commend all of you. If you have those courses, take them. Public education, get more people involved. And it's not necessarily our skill set, but let's appreciate the importance of visibility. Lawyers are often storytellers, but pride marches matter too, and visibility in large corporations and media coverage. I keep remarking, I say this to Dorina, we're watching TV, and it's like the routine inclusion of LGBTQ characters in entertainment TV, not as sort of contrived plot devices, but just as more or less unremarkable characters. And in ads, somebody who's now part of an interracially blended extended family. I mean, seeing same-sex couples and interracial families, at least on MSNBC. So it's been transformational. And so I think of us as lawyers, as strategists, as tacticians, as storytellers, and as people who need to take advantage of the skills of our colleagues, what they bring to those educational and organizing efforts. And it's not one recipe, but it's an important blending of all those ingredients.
Great. Do you have any advice for people wanting to work in the field of LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And Dean Morrison didn't pay me to say this, but take advantage of the wonderful training that you can get at NYU, both in the classroom and in the amazing environment of New York City with all the organizations there that you can get to know. The opportunities to do internships, give you an opportunity to see what the work is really like, and also to start building your network of relationships. Some years ago, lots of public interest groups kind of looked askance at experience in big law firms, and that's really not true anymore. People get experience and pay off debt, and it's fine. But it does help if you have the opportunity to participate either as cooperating counsel or volunteer in some ways, so that people can get to know you. So you can decide if it's what you would really want to do or not. And clerking also is an invaluable experience. I think my main advice really is to look for good mentors and don't presume too much where you're going to find them. One of my best teachers was not an abortion rights lawyer that when I was working at NARAL, or a lesbian feminist family law attorney when I was working for a small firm. He was a Canadian chemical engineer patent litigator. It's like the last place I would have looked for a mentor. And he was wonderful, and he remains a good friend. So look for teachers and colleagues, and really see them. Don't assume you know what they're going to look like or where you're going to find them.
Wonderful. Does Lambda Legal have a different legal focus or strategy than its peers who also do LGBTQ impact litigation, like HRC or ACLU?
I think there's a lot of harmony among the organizations. And actually, that's not an accident. During the effort in the 80s to address the state sodomy laws, the Litigation Roundtable was created. It had a different name then, but bringing together people working in the area to share best thinking, because what one lawyer does over here can affect and sometimes really thwart somebody else's smart effort somewhere else. And over the years since then, I mean, really since the mid 80s to now, that roundtable has continued, and it's gone from a couple dozen people who are mostly in private practice, just a handful at public interest organizations, to now it's more than 100 people. It's challenging to find a good space to hold these meetings, and most of them are at public interest organizations. We could have chaos if we didn't talk to each other and share our best thinking and coordinate. So of course there are differences in emphasis, and sometimes when an organization takes a lead in a particular area, others will take a lead in a different area, and we try to support each other. So for example, Lambda Legal has a Fair Courts project that has really tried to broaden public awareness of both elections of judges and recall efforts against judges and what's happening on the federal bench, and that's something that's kind of unique. And I would say, we are having a particular focus also on voting rights these days, and I hope everyone's paying attention to the crisis that we have there. I mean, it's not going to be very useful to be a skilled lawyer if our courts and legal system as a whole doesn't follow the rule of law anymore. But then there are, National Center for Lesbian Rights has taken a lead on trying to end so-called reparative therapy or conversion therapy, and Lambda Legal has played a supporting role in that work. So we do try to coordinate And sometimes it makes sense to work together because, you know, we're going up against governments. And so if we have, you know, 3 or 4 people at 2 organizations working together, we're not over lawyering it. And in fact, it's kind of essential to bring a little bit more muscle to the fight. So, you know, it is new that HRC is doing litigation. And it's somewhat newer that Lambda Legal has a presence in DC, which we started when Trump was elected to try to be more effective at dealing with that administration. And so we like each other, we work together, we try to share our best thinking and not get in each other's way too much. And I think that's part of why we've had so much success.
Wonderful. Also want to again encourage people to submit questions using the Q&A feature if they have any more. So one thing you mentioned in your speech, Jenny, was talking about your work on the board of Outright. So a question I have is, so it's true that like a lot of the harms that are happening to the LGBTQ community these days are harms that are happening around the world. Particularly, there are places where people in our community are harmed a lot more than some of us are harmed in our own country. So how do we be an ally for people in our community around the world without trampling on the agency of those communities and or activist groups in their own countries?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's really important. And that is an important part of why I have followed Outright's work for many years. Actually, we just had our 30th anniversary because the organization does work by partnering with grassroots, emerging leaders and organizations in country. People know what's going to be smart and strategic and what would really be a bad idea in their own community. I mean, it does not help for folks from, you know, global north countries to sort of come in with a lot of fanfare and spout off a lot of stuff, bring a lot of turmoil and then leave, for where folks doing the work in the community then get squashed. And squashed can be, you know, absolutely physically literal. So I think what we can do is support organizations like Outright, which is why I do that, that is about sharing a lot of different types of resources and support, much of which, you know, as a you know, lawyer living in Los Angeles, I'm not in a great position sometimes to be able to directly help, but Outright is able to function as an intermediary, seeking funding from governments and private foundations and major companies like, you know, Google has been very generous, and providing those resources to emerging groups that wouldn't have the infrastructure and be able to seek them themselves, and to bring folks to the UN to be able to engage directly with the leaders of their country in a way that they would never be able to do at home. And then I think there are some things that we can do. I mean, I personally have been learning and very much enjoying being able to provide some mentorship and consultation to lawyers who are trying to develop the strategies that may work in their own countries. I mean, I'm working with a couple of young gay men who are Chinese and trained in Chinese law, who have been trying to work with some other lawyers in China to figure out how to develop legal protections, especially now, given the government crackdown. And it's a motivating privilege for me to get to do that because they're so creative and they're so brave and smart and thoughtful. The work in many countries where things are really hostile now, well, we know that's going to take many years. It's taken many years here, but being good allies can really make a difference. You know, expressing to people that you care and that you believe in them, sharing ideas and just being a thought partner can encourage people to continue. I would invite people to go to the Outright website and learn more about what's going on. Also, let us recognize that US law has for a long time professed to offer refuge to people fleeing persecution, including persecution based on an LGBTQ identity or HIV status. And our government has often fallen short in following the law in that regard. People do flee persecution, seeking safety here, and it is among the things that we can do. Lambda Legal's doing some of this work as US lawyers to help insist that US law recognize people and that people should be granted asylum or protection under the Convention Against Torture. So we can push the State Department to do more. We can push, ICE to do better, and we can also be good friends and thought partners to colleagues, wherever they may be doing work that's really hard.
Thank you for that answer, Jenny. A question from an admitted student who says they're interested in transactional work. They said they feel like so much of pro bono public interest work generally is litigation focused. Do you agree with that assessment? If so, how can transactional lawyers get involved as they don't develop litigation and advocacy skills during normal practice?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question. So, I've got to channel my colleagues in the development department first and say, well, become a member, provide financial support. None of this work is possible if we don't have the resources to do it, and encourage, friends and colleagues at work to do the same. But, sometimes we really appreciate having help to do research of various kinds. The work these days has a lot more policy advocacy in it, and different types of public education. I had a wonderful collaboration some years ago with some tax lawyers with one of the major firms in California when we had this, really wacky, confusing situation of we had achieved community property rights through the registered domestic partner laws that I had the privilege of helping to write. And that meant that we had tax liability under the federal laws because each registered domestic partner had an equal share of ownership in each other's salary and blah, blah, blah. So tax law, they got to know better than to start giving tax advice if you don't really know what you're doing. And we were able to put together a wonderful fact sheet for people through the research and guidance of these tax specialists. So, one of the fascinating, great things about LGBTQ law is that it tends to crop up in all sorts of areas. And often those are areas that, I can have a passing dilettantish knowledge of, but I would be dangerous if I didn't get help from people who really know. So don't assume that whatever you may be doing in whatever your field of practice is not relevant. And also then be patient, because we really appreciate people saying, I'd like to help, please let me know if you have something appropriate, and not expecting that we can necessarily pull the ideal project right out of our heads. The reality is we get roughly 5,000 calls for help through our help desk. Only a tiny fraction are appropriate cases for us to litigate because of the issue and the court and the timing and so forth. And that's really hard, to not help people who we would want to represent. And the same is true of folks who are smart, determined, and would like to help. Sometimes you have to be patient, but thank you in advance for the interest. I hope that you will do that.
Wonderful. I think this might be the last question I have for you, Jenny. What motivates you to continue the fight when roadblocks like Prop 8, like the stalling of the Equality Act, stall progress?
Yeah, well, so, I'll just challenge your premise a tiny bit, because, I didn't experience Prop 8 as stalling progress because, we went from one thing to another to another. I mean, it was sort of a nonstop whirlwind there for years. Yes, the ballot measure passed. And so then we immediately sued. And then, the campaigning that had been to try to stop Prop 8 shifted to, well, should we bring this back to the ballot in 2010 or 2012, and how do we continue the public education? And meanwhile, we were litigating in Iowa, which, by the way, we won unanimously, and the activity continued to expand. But but you're right. There's losses, and they are sometimes devastating, and sometimes they're bewildering, and they're always infuriating. I had not a loss today, but a decision from the Oregon Court of Appeal in a wedding cake case that affirmed that there is liability on the part of the business that refused to make a cake for our clients, but some, I think, sort of circuitous and tortured reasoning to send it back to reassess damages. And these poor women, it's been like almost a decade of dealing with this. It can be really frustrating. But but I have tried to stay motivated by, or have been motivated by changing my focus on a regular basis. So I keep trying new things and learning new things and working with new people. And our movement it's really wonderful that we now have enough resources that people can sometimes take a sabbatical break, and it's like nothing like academic sabbaticals, but at least it's something. And like I said, working with some of the advocates overseas just puts our situation in perspective. And it's also really interesting. And to the question that you asked, how can we be helpful? It's an opportunity to learn and a reminder of what we've been able to accomplish by working together. So that sense of gratitude, and then also the optimism, the hopefulness of folks that are at a much earlier stage of their country's journey. It's just a sense of gratitude, and like, how can you not be inspired? How could you feel despondent or sort of sit around and whine when you see people that are taking on not just, a harsh situation, but often a dangerous one. So that's what I would say. And like I said, and I would say this to all of you, in my experience, this work has been deeply fulfilling. A chance to work with wonderful people that are similarly committed. And, that's, sometimes it doesn't feel motivating at 2:00 in the morning when your brief is due, but stepping back a minute, it's an extraordinary privilege. So think about all the wonderful things you can do with your legal training. So many different things, and you're needed. You're all needed. I mean, needed to protect voting rights right now. Needed to push back against all kinds of rollbacks of basic civil rights and civil liberties. So please take advantage of the wonderful training that you're being offered. And then many of us are depending on you to join us in the fight.
Thank you so much for those powerful and thoughtful answers, Jenny. Once again, we want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing for our community, what your existence as a LGBTQ person in the legal field means for us all. Thank you too to everyone watching at home for joining us on this very special evening. Please look out for Outlaw events in the near future. Bye all.